This is Joe Kopsick. It's July 25th, 2021, and I want to tell you about the lies that have been perpetrated against the American public about the Boogaloo Boys or Boogaloo movement. People are saying that they're white supremacists and neo-Nazi. They're saying that the term Boogaloo refers to a second American Civil War or second American Revolution. That part is true, but this says that they're preparing for it. They're preparing for the American Civil War or American Revolution, Second American Revolution. That's true. But it's not true that they seek to incite one. That's like what Charlie Manson allegedly wanted to do, like what Vincent Bugliosi said, that Charlie Manson wanted to incite a race war. That's not what the Boogaloo Boys are about. The Boogaloo Boys, and this is not reported like at all anywhere, they call themselves the Boogaloo Boys because they want to prevent a second American Civil War or American Civil War II Electric Boogaloo. They call themselves this because in the movie, there was a movie in the 80s, a breakdancing movie starring a bunch of black kids called like Breakin' and Breakin' 2. Electric Boogaloo was the sequel. Kids like dancing on the ceiling and shit. So it's said that they want to start a race war. That's not true. They want to fix the country and bring shit together so that we avoid a race war or Second American Revolution or Second Civil War. You know what they're doing at protests? And this is what Magnus Penvidea said to Jimmy Dore, that Jimmy Dore got so much shit for interviewing this guy associated with the Boogaloo Boys named Magnus Penvidea, Magnuspenvidya. And this guy said that at protests, the Boogaloo Boys were protecting Black Lives Matter protesters, protecting black activists from Proud Boys. You hear what I'm saying? The Boogaloo Boys were fighting Proud Boys because the Proud Boys were probably inciting violence against the African American members of the BLM protesters. So these guys are not neo-Nazis. The government, and the propagandists try to say that they're neo-Nazis because they protest, they're libertarians and a lot of them are anarchists, but some people describe them as alt-right. These guys protest what the federal government did at Waco and Ruby Ridge, and they do that not because they just hate the federal government and like want to take healthcare away from kids or deprive you of the minimum wage. They oppose what happened in Waco and Ruby Ridge because they're incidents when the federal government killed American citizen children unprovoked and illegally, when they could have gone after the leader of the cult leader in Waco when he was walking around downtown. He would walk around like in downtown Waco, and they knew that they could have gotten him there one of the many times he left his home, instead of setting his house on fire and murdering 128 people, including pregnant women and children. And then in Ruby Ridge, there was some allegedly, Nazi guy. Some guy hated Jews, and then the federal government decided that he's not allowed to have children because of that. So they murdered one of his 2 children. It says they hold up things like the McVeigh bombing of Oklahoma City Federal Building and the armed response to Ruby Ridge as heroic moments in American history. It's like, well, what the fuck are we supposed to do when the federal government's, then we knew, killing children with fire and killing pregnant women? Because of what their father did. They could have arrested the father instead of holding the children accountable. What are you supposed to do? Not protest? And now, as we know, they're trafficking our children for Israeli fucking sex cults or some shit. Or the Israeli army. Jeffrey Epstein and his friends. And he's got all these people, like, no wonder. He had all these friends in the federal government. He's known these people since the 80s. This is why we don't like the federal government, because they're setting children on fire and they're raping our children and selling them to fucking sex cults and foreign governments and billionaires and shit. Why wouldn't you be against the federal government when it murders children unprovoked? Say we're Nazis just because we don't think someone should have their children shot in front of them by the police because they are aware that some Jewish people have committed crimes like Jeffrey Epstein? You don't even interview these people, find out whether they hold all Jewish people accountable for that shit. I don't. I never have. And I still have believed since 2008, 2010, since I started thinking about it, yeah, what the federal government did at Ruby Ridge and Waco was wrong. They could have arrested the people who were responsible instead of holding the children accountable for their father's crimes. And yeah, maybe their fathers, yes, they were definitely a neo-Nazi, racist, anti-Semite. I'm talking about the people at Ruby Ridge and Waco, and the guy at Waco was a child molester. Keep in mind, this is a time when it was legal to have sex with a 15-year-old girl in Texas, so the government was just as responsible for that guy, having all these child brides. They were legalizing it. It was fucking legal. And the federal government decides they have to shoot him? What? So we can have a fucking 16-year-old age of consent that's nationwide that people don't know? The federal government's taking away the rights of states to have 17 and 18-year-old age of consent? The federal government is setting your fucking children on fire, dude. Why wouldn't the Boogaloo Boys exist? Why wouldn't they want to protect black people from Proud Boys at protests when we know the cops won't? I'm a private security guard. I know. They don't have any obligation to protect you because of Warren versus DC, 1981. I would love to protect some Black Lives Matter protesters at a protest if some fucking Proud Boys try to jack their shit up. Fucking go. I love to fucking put a fucking trash can over the head of a cop when he's looking around unsuspected. If the cops are fucking planning on pepper spraying everyone and dispersing the crowd before anyone even fucking does anything, and the cops incite people to do things. This article says that the Boogaloo Boys somewhere were affiliated with people trying to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, which has recently been exposed that the FBI not just infiltrated, they started it. The FBI started it. Jimmy Dore did a report recently. The kidnapping of Gretchen Whitmer wouldn't have happened if the FBI and the police hadn't started it. What the police did really blurs what's the line between entrapment and catching criminals. The police paid people to go to a hotel and paid for their food and paid for their room and board in some cases in order to entice them and incite them and provoke them and arm them, into attempting to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer. They did this just like the way they set up, half-retarded Middle Eastern men. It's like, let's find a half-retarded Middle Eastern guy who's pissed off at Israel, and then we'll train him, fund him, and arm him, give him some pilot training, and then we'll catch him in the act. And the cops get, a bunch of applause for catching the guy in the act, and then there's more money for the police station, for the police departments, the anti-terrorism measures. And then if the cops fail to catch a criminal in the act, a guy who they've provoked and armed and trained, and in some case given military secrets or access at least, then they fail, and then it's just more money for the police because the police need money for training because they failed. They need more weapons because more money and more spending is the only way to solve any problems. Just blow all your money on it. So read the Wikipedia entry for the Boogaloo movement, also called the Boogaloo Boys. It is messed up. It tries to paint these people as anti-government just because there's anarchists and libertarians who have legitimate gripes against the government. It tries to paint them as racist, even though there's things on there that admits the Boogaloo Boys detest the police killing of black people just as much as they detested of white people. The Wikipedia entry on Boogaloo movement says, adherents of the Boogaloo sometimes carry black and white versions of the American flag with a middle stripe replaced with a stripe of red tropical print and the stars replaced with an igloo. The stripe sometimes lists the names of people who have been killed by police, including Eric Gardner, Vicki Weaver, Robert Lavoie Finicum, Breonna Taylor, and Duncan Lemp. I haven't heard of two of those people, but at least two of those people are African American. Robert Lavoie Finicum was a white guy who hung out with Native Americans, and shortly before he was murdered, he was a 70-year-old man. He was standing up in the snow. The police forced his vehicle to crash. He had a couple other people in the vehicle with him. They murdered him because he was trying to put his arms up to stop from falling over in the snow, or he was trying to surrender. He was not armed. They shot an old man to death in the snow for trying to surrender and trying to keep his balance. So that's what your federal government did. That was the FBI. That's what they did in Oregon to the response, as the response to the fact that Clive was his name, whatever his name from Nevada, was racist. The guy said that black people were better under slavery than under Obama. He's trying to criticize Obama, but people said that was racist, so someone had to die. Turns out it was this guy, Robert Lavoie Finicum, who knew one of that guy's sons, and even though Robert Lavoie Finicum, before he was murdered by the federal government, he was trying to expose the fact that the federal government at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge was improperly displaying Native American artifacts. They were displaying them at the corner of the building, on the outside of the building. disgracing these artifacts, and he had video filming it, proving it. And the federal government killed him because the federal government doesn't give a shit about him and his Native American friends or his cattle ranching friends. They don't care if your cattle ranch is going to get set on fire. They don't want the Bureau of Land Management to help you with that because they don't give a shit about you. The federal government wants to take your land, whether you're a white guy or a farmer, Native American, black, whatever. Here's something else I found was interesting. They call themselves the Mujahideen. Now, I'm not saying they can't be racist using a word like Mujahideen. Just how often do you hear Republicans or right-wingers talking about the Mujahideen? How often you hear right-wingers? Most people talking about the Mujahideen know that America armed the Mujahideen and don't like it. And that's part of the reason why we don't like the federal government. So I find it hard to believe that these guys are all right-wingers or racist if they call themselves the Mujahideen. Not saying a person who uses, Muslim epithets can't be racist, but I don't think that's what they're doing here. And the claim that they hold up things like the McVeigh bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building and the Ruby Ridge, this is a claim made by this guy named Alex Newhouse, a digital researcher at Middlebury CTEC. This guy might be involved with, the CIA. Like, he's an international intelligence researcher. So, like, this guy's trying to paint Boogaloo Bois as right wing, and the Department of Homeland Security tweeted and said that they are not right wing or left wing. It says they're simply violent extremists from both ends of the ideological spectrum. But that doesn't mean the Boogaloo Bois are right wing. They hate the police. The reason why they have this whole, luau theme is because, here we go. Boogaloo memes are not subtle. The uniform for supporters, a Hawaiian shirt paired with body armor and a military-style rifle, is in part a joke about killing pigs, slang for cops, for a Hawaiian-style pig roast. These guys hate the cops so much that they're willing to joke about killing cops, killing pigs. These guys are not right-wingers. They're not all racists. They're not all right. They're people who want to stop blacks and whites from fighting with each other and get black and white protesters to focus on their common enemy, the federal government that's setting your fucking kids on fire. Boogaloo Bois are not a threat. The Proud Boys are, but the Boogaloo Bois aren't. Proud Boys and BLM should stop fighting each other. They should accept the Boogaloo Bois' protection as long as they all work together to fight the federal government and stop police from killing people without a warrant and without any reason to suspect them of any crime. But they'll just try to make Boogaloo Bois look like murderers. Check this out. Look how they try to play you. At least 15 arrests and 5 deaths have been publicly linked to Boogaloo rhetoric. Not the Boogaloo Bois, not any particular people, just the rhetoric, which they say is basically any anti-government or racist rhetoric, which Boogaloo Bois don't necessarily all engage in. They're anti-racist because they're, as I said, and as Magnus Panvidia said on the Jimmy Dore Show, they're protecting black BLM members from white racist Proud Boys who have forgotten that their enemy is not the black man, it's the government and the cops. The Boogaloo Bois are not as far right as Ron Paul, and they're not as far left as socialists. Like Magnus Panvidia said, he supports libertarians and Greens, but he also considers himself an anarchist. Like, these guys are not far left or far right. They want a compromise that will prevent a race war and prevent people not getting along on an economic basis. Like, it's really the federal government's fault that the things like the Boogaloo Bois are happening, because it's the federal government that has killed people in their homes when there's other ways to deal with those problems. The federal government has not looked for enough ways to avoid violence. That's the federal government supposed to exist for. It's supposed to exist to stop the states from trampling all over our rights and to stop the cops from trampling all over our rights. It doesn't do that, but it's supposed to. So that's why people in the Boogaloo Bois see themselves as, the continuation of what the founding fathers started, which was we tried to have a system with due process and fair trials. It didn't really work out, but that doesn't mean we should give up. See? One guy says he's a left anarchist. These people are not extremists. They're just radicals. It's a difference. An extremist is someone who supports violence or is a zealot. And, doesn't want to compromise with anybody, and wants to force other people to live the way they want to live. A radical is someone who gets to the root of the problem. That's what the word radical means. The root of the word is radix. That means root. When you get to the root of a problem, people fighting along racial and economic lines instead of uniting against the fascist government, no matter what party is in charge, no matter posing left or posing right parties in charge. There are left anarchists and there are left-leaning people, and there are anarchists. There are anti-racists among the Boogaloo Boys. That's most of them. The alt-right group is the Proud Boys. They're trying to make it seem like Trump and the alt-right and the Boogaloo Boys and the Proud Boys are all aligned, and they're not. The Boogaloo Boys are against the Proud Boys because the Proud Boys start violence at protests. That's why the Boogaloo Boys exist, to prevent violence at protests, because the police refuse to.